There is a story that most history books prefer to tell softly, if they tell it at all. It is a story about the most powerful empire on earth waging two separate wars against a sovereign nation, not because of an assassination, not because of a border dispute, and not because of ideology, but because that nation had the audacity to say no to buying drugs. And these were not just any drugs. We are talking about opium, a substance so addictive and so destructive that it had already hollowed out millions of lives from the inside. The British Empire did not stumble into this situation by accident. It engineered the entire machinery of addiction from the poppy fields of Bengal to the harbors of Canton. And when China tried to shut the door on a trade that was poisoning its people, Britain kicked that door down with warships and cannons and treaties written at gunpoint. The prize they extracted from the wreckage of that conflict, a small rocky island off the southern coast of China, would remain in British hands for over 150 years until 1997. That island was Hong Kong. This is one of those chapters of history where every layer you peel back reveals something uglier underneath. And what makes it so uncomfortable is that it was not conducted by rogue agents or shadowy operatives. It was sanctioned by Parliament, blessed by the Crown, financed by the East India Company, and cheered on by a merchant class that had convinced itself that free trade was a moral imperative even when the commodity being traded was misery. So let us go back to where the story really begins. Not in China, not in London, but in the sweltering poppy fields of colonial India. To understand why Britain went to war over opium, you first have to understand a problem that had been gnawing at the British Empire for decades. A trade imbalance so severe that it was draining silver out of England at an alarming rate. You see, the British public had developed an insatiable appetite for Chinese goods, tea, silk, and porcelain. These were the luxuries that the British middle and upper classes could not live without. Tea alone had become so embedded in British culture that it was practically a national institution. By the late 1700s, Britain was importing tens of millions of pounds worth of Chinese tea every single year. But here was the problem. China did not want anything Britain had to sell. The Qing dynasty, which had ruled China since 1644, operated under a philosophy of self-sufficiency. The Chinese emperor famously told a British trade delegation that China possessed all things in abundance and that there was no need for the products of outside barbarians. And he was not entirely wrong. China's economy was enormous, its manufacturing capabilities were advanced, and its domestic market was largely self-contained. British wool, British clocks, British manufactured goods, none of it moved the needle. This created what economists call a chronic trade deficit. Britain was hemorrhaging silver to pay for all those Chinese exports, and the only thing flowing in the other direction was precious metal leaving British vaults. Now, for any empire built on commerce, this kind of imbalance is not just inconvenient, it is existential. And so the men who ran the British East India Company, which at this point was less of a trading company and more of a private empire with its own army and its own government, began searching for a product that would reverse the flow of silver. They needed something that China would not just want, but something China would desperately need, something that would create its own demand once introduced. And they found it in the poppy fields of Bengal. The British East India Company had established a formal monopoly on opium cultivation in the Bengal region of India in 1773. This was not some accidental byproduct of trade. It was a deliberate, calculated decision. The company developed a sophisticated agricultural system in which Indian peasants, many of them already impoverished under colonial rule, were compelled to grow poppies on their best farmland. The opium was processed at massive factories in places like Patna and Benares, where workers shaped the raw paste into large balls, packed them into chests made from Nepalese timber, and shipped them down the Ganges River to Kolkata. From there, the chests were auctioned off to private British merchants who then loaded them onto fast sailing ships bound for the coast of southern China. The entire system was designed with a deliberate layer of deniability. The East India Company itself did not technically sell opium in China. Instead, it sold the opium to middlemen at auction, and those middlemen were the ones who ran the smuggling operations. This meant the company could claim clean hands while still pocketing enormous profits from every chest that left Kolkata. It was a masterpiece of corporate plausible deniability, a system that would make any modern cartel envious. The numbers were staggering. In 1729, when the Qing dynasty first banned the sale of opium for smoking, imports amounted to roughly 200 chests per year. By 1820, that number had exploded to around 10,000 chests annually. And by 1838, the year before the First War broke out, an estimated 40,000 chests of opium were pouring into China every single year. Each chest contained roughly 140 pounds of processed opium. Do the math. That is over 5 million pounds of opium flooding into a single country annually. And virtually all of it was grown under the supervision of the British East India Company. The effect on Chinese society was catastrophic. Opium addiction spread like wildfire across every social class. Laborers, soldiers, government officials, even members of the imperial court succumbed to the drug. Entire communities were hollowed out. Productivity collapsed in affected regions. Families were destroyed as breadwinners spent every last coin chasing the next pipe. And the economic damage was just as severe as the human toll. Before the opium trade took hold, China had enjoyed a trade surplus with Europe. Silver flowed into the country in exchange for tea, silk, and porcelain. But now the flow had reversed completely. Chinese silver was flooding out of the country to pay for opium, creating a monetary crisis that threatened the stability of the entire Qing economy. Taxes went uncollected. Government salaries went unpaid. The currency itself was destabilizing. The Qing court was not blind to what was happening. There had been imperial edicts banning opium as far back as 1729. And these bans were reissued repeatedly throughout the late 1700s and early 1800s. But enforcement was another matter entirely. Corruption was rampant. Local officials along the coast were bribed by smugglers to look the other way. The profits were simply too enormous for everyone involved on both the British and the Chinese side for the bans to have any teeth. But by the late 1830s, the crisis had become impossible to ignore. The Daoguang Emperor, watching his empire slowly consume from within, decided that half measures were no longer an option. He needed someone incorruptible, someone fearless, someone willing to confront not just the smugglers, but the most powerful trading empire on earth. And so, in December of 1838, he appointed a man named Lin Zexu as imperial commissioner with extraordinary powers and a single mandate: end the opium trade, whatever it takes. Lin Zexu was a remarkable figure, a scholar official of impeccable reputation. He had risen through the ranks of the Qing bureaucracy on the strength of his intellect, his integrity, and his genuine concern for the welfare of ordinary Chinese people. He was known for his honesty in a system riddled with corruption, and he approached his new assignment with a level of moral clarity that was unusual for anyone in a position of power. When he arrived in Canton, which was the only port where foreign trade with China was legally permitted, he did not waste time with polite negotiations. He moved with startling speed and decisiveness. First, he ordered the arrest of Chinese opium dealers and the confiscation of opium pipes across the province. He executed several dealers publicly to demonstrate that the government was serious. Then he turned his attention to the foreign merchants. He demanded that every British and American trader in Canton hand over their entire inventory of opium and sign a pledge never to import the drug again under penalty of death. When the merchants hesitated, Lin ordered the factories where they lived and worked to be surrounded and sealed off. Food deliveries were stopped. Chinese servants were withdrawn. The merchants were effectively held hostage until they complied. The British superintendent of trade in China, a man named Charles Elliot, found himself in an impossible position. He could not fight his way out, and the merchants were growing increasingly desperate. So Elliot made a fateful decision. He told the merchants to surrender their opium, promising them that the British government would compensate them for their losses. In total, over 20,000 chests of opium were turned over to Commissioner Lin. The haul was worth millions, even by the standards of that era. And then came one of the most dramatic moments in the entire saga. Over 23 days in June of 1839, Lin Zexu personally supervised the destruction of the surrendered opium at Human near the mouth of the Pearl River. Workers dug massive trenches and filled them with salt water and lime. The opium was dissolved and flushed out to sea. According to the historical accounts, Lin even offered a prayer of apology to the spirit of the South China Sea, asking the creatures of the water to move away temporarily so they would not be contaminated. It was a public spectacle designed to demonstrate the resolve of the Chinese Empire, and it sent shockwaves across the world. But Lin Zexu did not stop there. He also wrote a remarkable letter to Queen Victoria herself, a document that remains one of the most extraordinary pieces of diplomatic correspondence in history. In it, he appealed to her sense of morality. He pointed out that opium was illegal in Britain itself and asked her how she could justify flooding China with a substance that her own laws prohibited her subjects from using. He asked whether the pursuit of profit could truly justify poisoning millions of people. He reminded her that China had always traded in good faith, offering tea and silk and porcelain in exchange for silver, products that nourished rather than destroyed. There remains some historical debate over whether Queen Victoria ever actually read the letter. What is not debated is that the British government did not respond to it. Instead, the British chose war. The destruction of the opium gave London exactly the pretext it needed. In the halls of Parliament, the issue was carefully reframed. This was not about drugs, the politicians insisted. This was about property rights. This was about free trade. This was about the honor of the British flag. The fact that the property in question was a narcotic that was illegal in both China and Britain itself was conveniently omitted from most of the debate. A military expedition was authorized, and in June of 1840, a fleet of British warships and troop transports arrived off the coast of China. What followed was not so much a war as it was a demonstration of overwhelming technological superiority. The Qing military was enormous in terms of manpower, but it was fighting with weapons and tactics that had not fundamentally changed in centuries. Chinese war junks with their wooden hulls and antiquated cannons were no match for British steamships with iron hulls and modern artillery. The HMS Nemesis, a British steam-powered iron warship, became a symbol of the technological gulf between the two forces. It could navigate shallow coastal waters where sailing ships could not go, and its guns could devastate Chinese fortifications from distances that Chinese cannons could not reach. The British did not march in a straight line to Beijing. Instead, they conducted a series of devastating coastal raids, seizing ports and islands as they moved north along the Chinese coast. They captured Chusan Island, blockaded the mouth of the Pearl River, and then pushed further north, threatening the vital grain transport route that connected southern China to the capital. The message was clear. Britain could strangle China's internal supply lines at will. The fighting was often brutal and one-sided. At the Battle of Canton in May of 1841, British forces overwhelmed Chinese defenses. At Amoy, at Ningbo, at Chapu, the pattern repeated itself. Chinese soldiers fought with enormous courage, sometimes literally to the last man, but they were simply outgunned. The technological gap was not a matter of slight advantage, it was a chasm. By the summer of 1842, British forces had pushed all the way up the Yangtze River and were threatening the city of Nanjing. The Qing court, facing the prospect of losing control of the most important waterway in the empire, finally agreed to negotiate. On the 29th of August 1842, aboard the British warship HMS Cornwallis, anchored on the Yangtze River at Nanjing, Chinese officials signed what would become known as the Treaty of Nanjing. It was the first of what Chinese historians call the unequal treaties, and it marked the beginning of what China still refers to as its century of humiliation. The terms were devastating. China was forced to cede the island of Hong Kong to Britain in perpetuity. 5 ports, Canton, Amoy, Fuzhou, Ningbo, and Shanghai, were open to British trade and residence, ending the old Canton system that had confined all foreign commerce to a single location. China was ordered to pay an indemnity of 21 million silver dollars, broken down as follows: 6 million for the opium that Lin Zexu had destroyed, 3 million for debts that Chinese merchants owed to British traders, and 12 million to cover the cost of the war itself. Think about that for a moment. China was being forced to pay for the war that Britain had waged against it. The treaty also established a fixed tariff system that stripped China of the ability to set its own trade duties, and it granted British citizens in China extraterritorial rights, meaning they could only be tried in British courts, even for crimes committed on Chinese soil. What the Treaty of Nanjing notably did not do was mention opium by name. The legality of the trade was left deliberately ambiguous, but the practical effect was unmistakable. With China's ability to enforce its own laws gutted, and with British merchants now operating freely in 5 major ports, opium imports did not decrease after the treaty. They doubled. By 1860, roughly 60,000 chests of opium were being imported into China annually. And as for Commissioner Lin Zexu, the man who had tried to save his country from addiction, the Daoguang Emperor blamed him for provoking the war. He was stripped of his titles and sent into exile in the remote northwest frontier of Xinjiang. It would take later generations to recognize him as a national hero. Today, he is celebrated in China as a pioneer in the war on drugs, a man who stood up to imperial aggression at enormous personal cost. But the story does not end with the First War because Britain was not satisfied. The Treaty of Nanjing had opened the door, but British merchants wanted it torn off its hinges. Trade volumes increased after 1842, but the British government and its commercial interests saw even greater potential for market expansion. They wanted the opium trade fully legalized. They wanted access to the Chinese interior, not just the coastal ports. They wanted foreign diplomats permanently stationed in Beijing, something the Qing court viewed as an intolerable affront to Chinese sovereignty. And they wanted the treaty renegotiated on even more favorable terms. The pretext for the Second Opium War arrived in October of 1856 when Chinese officials in Canton boarded a ship called the Arrow. The vessel was Chinese-owned but was registered under a British flag and was suspected of smuggling and piracy. Chinese authorities seized several crew members. The British claimed this constituted an insult to the British flag, even though there was considerable doubt about whether the ship's British registration was even valid at the time of the boarding. Nevertheless, it was the excuse that was needed. France joined the British cause using the execution of a French missionary in the Chinese interior as its own pretext for intervention. Together, the Anglo-French coalition assembled a formidable military force and launched what would become a far more destructive conflict than the First War. The Second Opium War unfolded in 2 major phases. In the first phase, between 1856 and 1858, British and French forces captured Canton and pushed north to the port city of Tianjin, threatening Beijing itself. The Qing court, already weakened by the massive Taiping rebellion that was raging across southern China, had no capacity to fight both an internal civil war and an external invasion simultaneously. In June of 1858, the Chinese were compelled to sign the treaties of Tianjin with Britain, France, Russia, and the United States. The terms were even harsher than those of the Treaty of Nanjing. 11 additional ports were open to foreign trade. Foreign diplomats were granted the right to establish permanent residences in Beijing. Christian missionaries were given the right to travel and proselytize throughout the Chinese interior. And critically, the import of opium into China was formally legalized. The drug that had ravaged Chinese society for decades, the substance that had provided the original cause of the wars, was now legal by treaty. China had been forced to accept the very thing it had fought 2 wars to prevent. But the Qing court attempted one last act of defiance. They refused to ratify the treaties and blocked a diplomatic delegation that was attempting to travel to Beijing to finalize the agreement. Chinese forces fired on British ships near the Taku forts, and several British negotiators were captured, tortured, and killed. This act of resistance, the capture and killing of the diplomatic envoys, sealed China's fate in the most devastating way imaginable. In 1860, a combined Anglo-French force of nearly 18,000 troops landed near Beijing and fought their way to the capital. The Battle of Palikao in September of 1860 saw Qing forces, including Mongol cavalry, shattered by modern European rifles and artillery. The road to Beijing was now completely open. The Shanfeng Emperor fled the capital, a humiliation that no Chinese ruler had suffered in centuries. And then came the act of destruction that still resonates in Chinese memory to this day. Lord Elgin, the British High Commissioner, ordered his troops to loot and burn the Yuanmingyuan, the old summer palace. This was not some minor government building. The Yuanmingyuan was one of the most magnificent architectural complexes in the world. It was a vast expanse of palaces, gardens, temples, and pavilions that had been built and refined over more than a century. It contained priceless artworks, ancient manuscripts, porcelain, jade, silks, and cultural artifacts that represented the accumulated heritage of Chinese civilization. British and French soldiers spent days looting the complex before putting it to the torch. The fires burned for 3 days and the smoke was visible from Beijing itself. The Yongle Encyclopedia, which had been the largest encyclopedia in the world at the time of its creation during the Ming Dynasty, was among the treasures destroyed. Only a tiny fraction of its volume survived. The burning of the Summer Palace was more than an act of military retribution. It was a calculated act of cultural humiliation, designed to show the Chinese court that no corner of the empire was beyond the reach of Western power. Lord Elgin himself reportedly justified the destruction by saying that it would make a lasting impression on the emperor and demonstrate that his palaces were not immune to Western force. With Beijing effectively occupied and the emperor in exile, his brother Prince Gong was left to negotiate surrender. In October of 1860, the Convention of Peking was signed, confirming all the terms of the treaties of Tianjin and adding new concessions. The Kowloon Peninsula, directly across the harbor from Hong Kong Island, was ceded to Britain. The indemnity payments were increased. Foreign powers gained the right to maintain permanent military garrisons in Beijing, and the opium trade, already legalized by treaty, surged to unprecedented levels. Now Britain held Hong Kong Island and Kowloon, but the final piece of the puzzle would come in 1898. By the late 19th century, the European powers were engaged in what historians call the scramble for concessions, carving out spheres of influence across a weakened China. When France leased the territory of Guangzhou on the southern coast, Britain seized the opportunity to demand an extension of its Hong Kong territory. On the 9th of June 1898, the Convention for the Extension of Hong Kong Territory was signed, leasing to Britain a vast swathe of land and 235 outlying islands, known as the New Territories. The lease was set at 99 years, effective from the 1st of July 1898, and expiring on the 30th of June 1997. At the time, 99 years must have seemed like forever, but eventually the clock ran out. What makes this entire saga so deeply uncomfortable is not just the violence or the hypocrisy. It is the fact that it was all done under the banner of progress. The British justified their actions through the language of free trade, a principle they held sacrosanct when it served their interests and conveniently ignored when it did not. The great irony is that opium was illegal in Britain itself. British law prohibited the recreational use of opium domestically, and yet the British government was willing to wage 2 wars to force another nation to accept that same substance. The contradiction was not lost on everyone. Within Britain itself, there was significant opposition to the Opium Wars. Members of Parliament denounced the conflict as immoral. The young William Gladstone, who would later become Prime Minister, declared that he did not know and had never read of a war more unjust in its origins. Public opinion in both Britain and America was divided, with many voices condemning the trade as an abomination. But the profits were simply too large and the strategic interests too compelling for morality to carry the day. And the profits were by any measure extraordinary. Opium revenue funded a significant portion of the British East India Company's operations in India, and the taxes paid on those profits comprised an ever-growing percentage of British government revenue. The entire colonial apparatus of British India was to a significant degree financed by the opium trade. The poppy fields of Bengal and Bihar were not just agricultural enterprises. They were the financial engines of empire. And the human cost of that engine was borne entirely by the people who had no voice in the arrangement: the Indian peasants who were forced to grow poppies instead of food, and the Chinese addicts whose lives were consumed by the drug. The consequences of the Opium Wars rippled far beyond the immediate military defeats. They set in motion a chain of events that would reshape China and the entire region for the next century and a half. The unequal treaties shattered the Qing dynasty's legitimacy. A ruling dynasty derives its authority from its ability to protect its people, and the Qing had demonstrably failed. The humiliation of the Opium Wars, combined with the ongoing devastation of the Taiping Rebellion, which claimed an estimated 20 million to 30 million lives, plunged China into decades of internal chaos. The dynasty limped on until 1912, when it was finally overthrown and replaced by the Republic of China. But its authority had been fatally undermined by the defeats of 1842 and 1860. The treaty port system that emerged from these wars created enclaves of foreign privilege across China's coast. Shanghai in particular transformed from a modest trading town into a major international city, but one where Chinese citizens were second class in their own country. The famous sign in a Shanghai park that allegedly read, "No dogs or Chinese allowed," may be apocryphal in its exact wording, but the sentiment it captures was entirely real. Foreigners in China lived under their own laws, enforced by their own courts, and Chinese authorities had no jurisdiction over them. This system of extraterritoriality was not dismantled until 1943. Meanwhile, the territory that Britain had extracted from China, Hong Kong, underwent an extraordinary transformation. What had been a sparsely populated island became one of the most dynamic commercial centers in Asia. The deep natural harbor that had attracted the British in the first place made Hong Kong an ideal trading hub. And the combination of British legal institutions, Chinese entrepreneurial energy, and its strategic location on the shipping lanes between Europe and East Asia turned it into a global financial powerhouse. By the 20th century, Hong Kong was a thriving city of skyscrapers and container ports, a place where East met West in a concentrated burst of commerce and culture. And yet the foundation upon which all of that prosperity was built remained what it had always been: a war fought to protect the right to sell drugs. As the 20th century progressed, the question of Hong Kong's future loomed ever larger. The new territory's lease, with its 99-year term, had a very specific expiration date. And as that date approached, the political landscape had changed beyond recognition. The China that had been forced to sign the unequal treaties was long gone. In its place stood the People's Republic of China, a nuclear-armed state with one of the largest economies in the world and a permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council. The Communist Party of China had never recognized the treaties as legitimate. From Beijing's perspective, every square inch of Hong Kong was sovereign Chinese territory that had been occupied by a foreign power. In the early 1980s, with the lease expiration now less than 2 decades away, businesses in Hong Kong began pressuring the British government for clarity. Property leases, mortgages, long-term contracts, all of these instruments required some assurance about what would happen after 1997. It was actually the British administration, not Beijing, that initiated the discussions about the handover. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher traveled to Beijing in 1982 to begin negotiations with the Chinese leadership, including Deng Xiaoping. Thatcher initially explored the possibility of retaining sovereignty over Hong Kong Island and southern Kowloon, which had been ceded in perpetuity by the treaties of 1842 and 1860, even if the new territories had to be returned. But this position quickly proved untenable. The new territories comprised the vast majority of Hong Kong's land area. The airport was there. The water supply infrastructure was there. Hong Kong Island and Kowloon simply could not function as independent entities without the new territories. Deng Xiaoping made it clear that China would resume sovereignty over all of Hong Kong and that there was no room for negotiation on that fundamental point. The only question was how the transition would be managed. The negotiations were tense, and at times they nearly collapsed. Economic confidence in Hong Kong plunged during the negotiation period, and there was a real fear among Hong Kong residents about what life under communist rule would mean for a city that had thrived under the rule of law, free markets, and civil liberties. But eventually, on the 19th of December 1984, Thatcher and Chinese Premier Zhao Ziyang signed the Sino-British Joint Declaration. Under its terms, Britain would return Hong Kong to China on the 1st of July 1997. In return, China agreed to govern Hong Kong as a special administrative region under the principle of one country, two systems. Hong Kong would retain its capitalist economy, its legal system, its civil liberties, and its way of life for a period of 50 years after the handover, meaning until 2047. The handover ceremony itself, held at midnight on the 30th of June, 1997, was a meticulously choreographed event watched by millions around the world. Prince Charles represented the British Crown. President Jiang Zemin represented the People's Republic. The Union Jack was lowered. the Chinese flag was raised, and 156 years of British colonial rule came to a quiet, formal end. For many, it was the symbolic close of the British Empire itself. The last significant colony had been returned to its original owner. But the story did not end with the ceremony. The promises made in the Joint Declaration and enshrined in Hong Kong's Basic Law became the subject of increasing tension in the decades that followed. The 50-year guarantee of autonomy, which had seemed so reassuring in 1984, began to feel less certain as Beijing's political influence over Hong Kong steadily grew. The introduction of national security legislation in 2020 reshaped the political landscape of the city in profound ways, and the question of whether the one country, two systems framework would survive until 2047 remains one of the defining geopolitical tensions of our era. There is one more dimension to the story that deserves attention because it connects the Opium Wars to something much larger than just the relationship between Britain and China. The forced opening of China through military violence established a template that other imperial powers quickly followed. France, Russia, Germany, Japan, and the United States all extracted their own concessions, treaty ports, and special privileges from a weakened Qing dynasty. The Treaty of Nanjing was not just a bilateral agreement. It was the first crack in a dam that released a flood of foreign exploitation. The most favored nation clauses that Britain inserted into its treaties meant that any privilege China granted to one foreign power automatically extended to all the others. Each new concession cascaded into further losses of sovereignty. This pattern of exploitation would directly contribute to the forces that shaped 20th century China. From the collapse of the Qing dynasty to the warlord era, to the rise of the Chinese Communist Party, to the Chinese Civil War, Mao Zedong explicitly invoked a century of humiliation as a motivating force in his revolution. The memory of the Opium Wars became foundational to modern Chinese national identity, a reminder of what happens when a nation is too weak to defend itself against foreign aggression. It is not an exaggeration to say that the wars Britain fought to sell opium in the 1840s and 1860s helped set in motion the political forces that would produce the People's Republic of China itself. And the economic innovations that the opium trade generated had their own legacy. The financial instruments developed to manage the risks of smuggling opium into China, the bills of exchange, the insurance contracts, the complex networks of credit that connected Kolkata to Canton to London. These were the building blocks of modern international finance. The opium trade was in a very real sense one of the earliest examples of a truly global supply chain, one that connected Indian agriculture, British manufacturing, Chinese consumption, and international banking into a single integrated system. The profits from that system funded railways in Britain, built mansions in Kolkata, and underwrote the expansion of the British Empire across multiple continents. Even the Rothschild family, those legendary architects of European finance, had connections to the web of commerce that the opium trade sustained. The East India Company's operations were deeply embedded in the financial networks that linked London, Bombay, and Canton. And the fortunes that were made in the opium trade did not simply disappear when the wars ended. They were reinvested, diversified, and multiplied over generations, contributing to the wealth structures that still shape global finance today. So when we look at the Opium Wars, we are not just looking at a historical curiosity. We are looking at a foundational event in the creation of the modern world, one that shaped the rise and fall of empires, the architecture of international trade, the boundaries of nation-states, and the moral contradictions at the heart of Western capitalism. It is a story about what happens when the logic of profit is allowed to override every other consideration, when a nation's sovereignty is treated as an obstacle to commerce rather than a right, and when the language of freedom is used to justify the most unfree of outcomes. The opium that the British East India Company grew in Bengal, processed in Patna, auctioned in Kolkata, and smuggled into Canton may be long gone. The trenches where Lin Zexu dissolved 20,000 chests of poison and lime and salt water have been covered over by the modern city of Dongguan. The warships that bombarded the Taku forts and sailed up the Yangtze have rusted into oblivion. But the consequences of what happened in those decades are still very much alive. They are alive in the skyscrapers of Hong Kong. They are alive in the political tensions of the South China Sea. They are alive in China's deep institutional memory of foreign humiliation, a memory that shapes its foreign policy, its military posture, and its relationship with the West to this day. And perhaps the most important lesson of all is this. When Britain destroyed the Summer Palace and forced China to legalize the opium trade, it did not just win a war, it created a wound that has never fully healed. And wounds like that, the kind inflicted not just on a government, but on the dignity of an entire civilization, have a way of echoing through centuries. They shape the way nations see themselves and, more importantly, the way they see the rest of the world. The story of the Opium Wars is a story about power, about greed, about the machinery of empire, and about the terrible things that can happen when a nation decides that its economic interests are more important than the lives and sovereignty of another people. It is uncomfortable. It is supposed to be. If this story changed the way you perceive the history of global trade and the foundations of modern empires, please subscribe to our channel and like this video. We are unearthing the history they tried to bury. Let us plant the seeds of the future together. The next treasure of the past will be opened soon.